Wood rattled under heavy knuckles just as her oil lamp flickered out. Abigail held her breath in total darkness. Outlaws didn't knock, but neither did salvation. When she eased back solid oak, a stranger filling her doorway smelled of wet wool, pine pitch, and old blood. He didn't ask for a hot meal. He didn't beg room by her fire. He just stared at ruined fencing behind her and said, "I'll sleep inside your barn and ask nothing else." The cold in the valley didn't just chill you, it hunted you. It found the gaps in the mud, chinking of the cabin, slipped under the warped floorboards, and settled deep in the marrow. Abigail Miller sat at the pine table, staring at her hands. The knuckles were split, crusted with dried blood and dirt that no amount of lye soap could scrub away. Tomorrow, she would have to butcher the last pig. Caleb had always done the butchering, but Caleb had been under the frost-hardened dirt of the churchyard for 8 months now. She rubbed her thumb over the callus on her palm. It felt like rough leather. Beside her, in the low cot near the cast-iron stove, 7-year-old Thomas shifted under a thin wool blanket. He coughed, a dry, rattling sound that made Abigail's stomach twist. They were out of willow bark. They were out of flour. They were nearly out of time. Outside, the wind howled, a low, guttural shriek that battered the side of the cabin. Then came the knock. It wasn't a frantic pounding. It was 3 heavy, measured thuds against the door. Abigail froze. Her heart didn't flutter. It seized, locking up in her chest. "We're 10 miles from town," she thought. "No one comes out here in the dark." She stood slowly. Her chair scraped against the wood floor, the sound deafening in the quiet room. She moved to the mantel, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy steel of Caleb's Navy Colt. It was too big for her hand, the balance all wrong. But she thumbed the hammer back, anyway. The metallic click-clack was loud enough to wake the dead. She stepped to the door. "Who is it?" Silence, save for the wind. Then, a voice, like gravel grinding under a wagon wheel. "A traveler. Looking for a dry floor." Abigail pressed her cheek against the rough grain of the door. "Town's a 2-hour ride east. Keep moving." "Horse is lame," the voice replied, devoid of any pleading. "Wind's dropping the temperature to a killing freeze. I ain't asking to come inside." She weighed her options. If he wanted to break in, a wooden latch wouldn't stop a determined man. If she turned him away, and they found him frozen on her property tomorrow, the guilt would ruin what was left of her conscience. She unbarred the door and cracked it open, leveling the heavy barrel of the Colt at chest height. The man standing on her porch was massive. He wore a heavy coat of buffalo hide, patched and repatched with sinew and raw leather. His face was obscured by a thick, matted beard and a felt hat pulled low, but she could see the sharp, tired glint of his eyes. He smelled strongly of wood smoke, old sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of dried blood on his sleeve. A heavy Sharps rifle hung from a strap on his shoulder. He didn't flinch at the gun pointed at his gut. He barely looked at it. "Barn's got a good roof," he said, his voice flat. He looked past her, toward the sagging structure across the yard. "I'll sleep in the barn and ask nothing else." Abigail swallowed. Her mouth was dry. "There's no hay left. It's just dirt and drafts. Better than out here. I don't have food for you." Didn't ask for any. He shifted his weight, and she noticed he favored his left leg, a heavy limp. "Name's Gideon. I'll be gone when the weather breaks." She studied him. He looked half feral, a mountain man pushed down from the high country by early snows. He was dangerous. Every instinct she had screamed at her to shut the door, but there was an exhaustion in his posture that mirrored her own, a bone-deep weariness that couldn't be faked. "The barn latch sticks," Abigail heard herself say. "You have to lift it before you pull. There's an empty stall on the south wall, least drafty." Gideon gave a single, curt nod. He didn't say thank you. He just turned and limped into the biting wind, leading a sway-backed roan that looked as miserable as he did. Abigail shut the door and dropped the iron bar back into place. She leaned her forehead against the wood, her hands shaking so badly she had to carefully ease the hammer of the Colt down to avoid a misfire. She walked over to the frost-rimed window and scraped a peephole with her thumbnail. Through the blowing snow, she watched the shadow of the man slip into the barn. He'll freeze, she thought, a cynical part of her hoping he would. A frozen stranger was easier to deal with than a living one. She stoked the dying embers in the stove, threw on their last good log, and sat in the chair, the gun resting on her lap. She didn't sleep. When the grey light of dawn finally crept through the window, the wind had died. Abigail woke with a start, a stiff crick in her neck from sleeping upright in the wooden chair. The fire was dead. The cabin was freezing. She stood, her joints popping, and set the Colt on the table. Thomas was still asleep, his breathing a little steadier this morning. She walked to the stove, struck a match, the sharp scent of sulphur cutting through the stale air, and got a small fire going with twigs and twisted paper. It was only then she heard it. Thwack. Pause. Thwack. The rhythmic, heavy sound of an axe biting into wood. Abigail hurried to the window. Out in the yard, the breath pluming from his mouth in thick white clouds, was Gideon. He had stripped off the heavy buffalo coat, revealing a faded flannel shirt that stretched tightly across broad, heavily muscled shoulders. He was at the chopping block, splitting the massive oak rounds Caleb had left untouched before his heart gave out. She watched, mesmerized by the sheer, brutal efficiency of his movements. He didn't swing with wild anger. It was a methodical, terrifying power. The heavy axe rose, fell, and the thick wood sheared apart with a violent crack. He was building a cord of firewood. Abigail frowned. Her cynicism flared immediately. What does he want? Men didn't do hard labor out of the goodness of their hearts, not in this territory. They did it because they expected payment. Payment she didn't have. She poured a cup of coffee. It wasn't real coffee. She hadn't afforded beans in months. It was roasted chicory root and dirt-cheap barley, bitter enough to strip paint off a wagon. She grabbed a second tin cup, chipped at the rim, filled it, and threw a heavy shawl over her shoulders. The cold bit into her cheeks the second she stepped onto the porch. Frost coated the mud of the yard, crunching under her boots. Gideon didn't stop swinging until she was 10 feet away. He buried the axe head into the block, leaving the handle vibrating, and turned to look at her. In the daylight, he was even more rugged. Deep lines etched the corners of his eyes. A thick, raised scar cut through his beard on the left side of his jaw, pale and shiny against his weathered skin. "I didn't ask you to do that," Abigail said, her voice sharp, defensive. "Didn't say you did," Gideon replied. He breathed heavily, steam rolling off his chest. She held out the tin cup. "It's chicory. It's awful. But it's hot." He stared at the cup for a long moment, as if expecting it to be a trap. Slowly, he reached out. His hands were massive, the skin cracked and stained with pitch. She noticed the top 2 joints of his left pinky were missing, the stump smooth and old. He took the cup, his fingers briefly brushing hers. His skin was like warm sandstone. He took a drink. He didn't grimace at the bitterness. "Obliged." "Why are you chopping my wood?" she asked, crossing her arms to ward off the cold. "Slept dry," he said simply. "Fair trade. One night in a freezing barn isn't worth a cord of oak." Gideon looked at her, really looked at her. His eyes were a pale, washed-out hazel. They held no pity, no warmth, just a flat, calculating intelligence. "Fences are down on the north ridge," he noted, gesturing with the tin cup. "Posts are rotted. Cattle will wander into the ravine if it snows again." "I know my fences are down," she snapped, a flush of embarrassed anger hitting her cheeks. I'll get to them." "Not with those hands, you won't." Abigail shoved her hands into the folds of her shawl, hiding the blisters. "That's none of your concern. You said you'd be gone when the weather broke. The sky is clear." Before Gideon could answer, the cabin door creaked open. Thomas stood on the porch, wrapped in his blanket, clutching a small wooden horse Caleb had carved for him. He stared at the giant man in the yard, his eyes wide. Thomas hadn't spoken a word to anyone but Abigail since the funeral. Gideon turned his head. He looked at the boy. He didn't offer a patronizing smile. He didn't crouch down and use a soft voice. He just stood there, drinking his terrible coffee. "Boy," Gideon rumbled. Thomas blinked. Gideon pointed to the scattered piles of split wood. "You got arms. Stack the kindling against the house. Keep it off the wet dirt." Abigail opened her mouth to protest, to tell him not to order her son around, to tell him Thomas was sick. But to her absolute shock, Thomas nodded. The boy dropped his blanket on the porch, walked down the steps in his oversized boots, and began picking up the small splinters of wood, carrying them to the cabin wall. Gideon finished his coffee and handed the cup back to Abigail. "I'll fix the fence," he said. "Then I'll ride out." He pulled the axe from the block and walked away, his heavy limp dragging slightly in the frost. Abigail stood in the yard, holding the empty tin cup, watching her mute son stack wood for a stranger. A strange, tight knot formed in her throat. She hated that she needed the help. But God, she needed the help. By midday, the frost had melted into a thick, clinging mud. Abigail was in the kitchen, scrubbing a cast-iron skillet with sand and a rag, when she heard the horses. It wasn't a single rider. It was a heavy, churning thud of multiple hooves coming up the lane. Her stomach dropped. She didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. The dread tasted like old pennies in her mouth. She dried her hands on her apron, her fingers trembling slightly, and stepped out onto the porch. 3 riders pulled up in her yard, their horses blowing hard, kicking up clumps of mud. At the front was Calloway. He was Josiah Trent's foreman, a lean, mean-looking man with a face like a hatchet and a permanent wad of chewing tobacco pushing out his lower lip. The 2 men flanking him were hired guns, plain and simple, wearing low-slung revolvers and dirty dusters. Calloway leaned forward in his saddle, resting his forearms on the saddle horn. He didn't take off his hat. The smell of horse sweat and stale whiskey rolled off him in the cold air. "Morning, Mrs. Miller," Calloway drawled, spitting a stream of brown juice into the mud near her lower step. "Mr. Calloway." Abigail kept her voice level, though her knees felt like water. "You're off Trent land. Lines are getting blurry these days." Calloway smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "Mr. Trent sent us over. Seems your cattle are wandering awful close to our water source on the creek." "The creek runs through public graze," she said, her chest tightening. "And my cattle are nowhere near it. They might be soon, seeing as your fences are rotting away to nothing." Calloway shifted his weight, his leather saddle creaking loudly. "Mr. Trent is losing patience, Abigail. He made a generous offer for this dirt patch. It's getting to be winter. A woman alone out here, with a sickly pup. You're gonna freeze or starve. Best sell now while you still get enough coin for a stagecoach ticket back east. I told Josiah last month, this land isn't for sale. My husband is buried on that hill." "Caleb's dead," Calloway said bluntly, wiping his mouth with the back of a filthy glove. "And dead men don't hold deeds. Now Mr. Trent wants this land cleared by the end of the month. If it ain't, well, accidents happen out here. Fires catch. Cattle get lost. Would be a shame." Bile rose in Abigail's throat. This was it. The veiled threats were gone. She was entirely alone. She thought of the heavy Colt inside on the table. She could never reach it in time. Even if she did, these men would shoot her before she cleared the doorframe. You threaten me again on my own property, she started, her voice cracking slightly, betraying her terror. Calloway laughed, a cruel, harsh sound. He spurred his horse a step closer, towering over her on the porch. Or what, widow? Who's going to stop me? A heavy, sickening thud echoed across the yard. Calloway's horse skittered sideways, tossing its head. The three men twisted in their saddles, their hands dropping to their holsters. Gideon stepped out from the shadowed doorway of the barn. He didn't have his rifle. He held a massive, 6-foot length of heavy oak timber over one shoulder, easily weighing 100 pounds, carrying it like it was a twig. He didn't run. He didn't posture. He simply walked toward them, his heavy boots sucking in the mud. His face was a mask of utter, chilling indifference. Calloway narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" Gideon didn't answer. He walked right up to Calloway's skittish bay horse, ignoring the two hired guns whose hands were white-knuckled on their pistol grips. Gideon let the heavy timber slide off his shoulder. It hit the mud with a wet slap, right between the horse's front legs. The horse whinnied and backed up. Gideon looked up at Calloway. The mountain man's dead-eyed stare was something Abigail had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was the look of a predator calculating exactly how much effort it would take to tear a man's throat out. "Your horse has a thrown shoe," Gideon said. His voice was quiet, barely carrying over the wind, but it commanded the air. "Left hind, quarter crack up the hoof wall." Calloway blinked, thrown completely off guard. "What?" "If you ride him hard back to Trent's place," Gideon continued, stepping half a pace closer to Calloway's boot in the stirrup, "he'll go lame. You'll have to shoot him." "Step back, you dirty son of a—" One of the hired guns started, drawing his pistol halfway out of the leather. Gideon didn't even look at the man. His eyes stayed locked on Calloway. "You draw that iron," Gideon whispered to the gun hand, "and I'll beat you to death with your own arm." The sheer, casual certainty in Gideon's voice froze the yard. No one moved. The hired gun swallowed hard, his hand hovering over his gun, unsure if the massive, scarred man in front of them was bluffing. Calloway looked from Gideon to the heavy timber on the ground, then up to Gideon's face. He saw the missing fingers, the scars, the heavy muscles coiled under the flannel shirt. Bullies recognized true violence, and Calloway suddenly realized he was out of his depth. "You tell Trent," Gideon said, his voice dropping an octave. "The widow's fences are being mended. The cattle stay where they are. Now ride out, before I get annoyed." Calloway's jaw worked furiously. He spat into the mud again, but missed Gideon by a wide margin. He reined his horse around hard. "This ain't over, Mrs. Miller, not by a long shot." He spurred the horse, and the three of them rode off, significantly faster than they had arrived. Abigail stood on the porch, her breathing shallow and fast. The adrenaline crash hit her all at once, making her knees buckle slightly. She grabbed the porch rail to steady herself, fighting the urge to vomit. Gideon watched the dust trail of the riders for a long moment. Then he bent down, hefted the 100-pound oak timber back onto his shoulder with a grunt, and turned toward the north ridge. He didn't look at Abigail. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't puff out his chest or wait for a thank you. He just went back to work. Abigail stared after him, a chaotic mix of profound relief and deep, unsettling anger washing over her. He had saved her from Calloway, yes. But in doing so, he had just painted a target on his own back, and, by extension, hers. The reality of the frontier was simple. You didn't poke a bear unless you intended to kill it. Gideon had just poked Josiah Trent, and Abigail knew, with sickening certainty, that blood was going to spill on her land before the snow fell. The killing frost held for 3 days. The ground turned to iron, and the mud in the yard froze into deep, jagged ruts that twisted an ankle if you weren't looking. Abigail knew she couldn't put it off any longer. The solitary hog in the pen out back, a massive, ill-tempered Berkshire cross Caleb had bought a year ago, was eating through the last of the grain. If they didn't butcher him today, they wouldn't have the feed to sustain him, and the meat would turn lean and tough. She stood by the fire pit in the side yard, her breath pluming in the grey morning air. She had dragged the heavy cast-iron cauldron from the shed and filled it with buckets of water from the pump. The fire beneath it popped and hissed, spitting pine sap. The water was just beginning to roll into a boil. Abigail held Caleb's long, boning knife. She had spent the last hour running it over a whetstone, the steady shh, shh sound scraping her nerves raw. She wasn't afraid of the blood. It was the sheer physical force required that terrified her. Caleb had been a large man. It took all of his weight to hold the hog down while he opened the artery. From the corner of her eye, she saw Gideon. He was on the roof of the barn, nailing down a loose sheet of tin he'd found buried in the tall grass. The loud, rhythmic bangs of his hammer echoed off the timberline. He had been there for 3 days. He barely spoke. He took his meals on the porch, mostly hardtack she baked, and whatever scraps of salted beef were left, and worked until the sun dipped below the ridge. She turned back to the pen. The hog grunted, a low, wet sound, pacing the small enclosure. It smelled of ammonia, wet bristles, and damp earth. Abigail swallowed hard, gripping the knife handle until her knuckles turned white. She unlatched the gate and stepped into the muck. The hog immediately turned, lowering its massive head, its small, intelligent eyes fixing on her. "Come on," she whispered, her voice trembling. She needed it close to the fence. She needed leverage. She lunged, grabbing the thick, coarse ear with her left hand, trying to drag its head to the side to expose the neck. The hog squealed, a deafening, high-pitched scream that vibrated in her teeth, and thrashed. 180 pounds of solid muscle threw her against the wooden slats. The breath left her lungs in a rush. She fell into the frozen muck, the knife slipping from her hand, the blade burying itself an inch deep in the dirt. The hog spun, clicking its heavy teeth. Before Abigail could scramble backward, a shadow blocked the pale sun. Gideon vaulted the fence. He didn't hesitate. He didn't try to soothe the animal. He moved with a sudden, shocking speed for a man of his size. He grabbed the hog by the hind leg and the opposite ear in one fluid motion, pivoting his hips and dropping his heavy weight squarely onto the animal's flank. The hog hit the ground with a heavy thud, pinned completely beneath Gideon's knee. The thrashing stopped, though the frantic squealing continued. Gideon didn't look at Abigail. He just held out his massive, scarred hand, palm up. Knife. Abigail scrambled to her knees. Her dress was soaked with foul-smelling mud, her ribs aching where she'd hit the fence. She yanked the knife from the dirt, wiped the blade quickly on her skirt, and placed the wooden handle into Gideon's waiting grip. He didn't make a show of it. He found the hollow just behind the jawbone and drove the blade in with a short, brutal thrust, twisting it sharply before pulling it out. Hot, dark blood arced into the freezing air, steaming instantly. The copper smell hit Abigail's nose, thick and metallic, mixing with the wood smoke from the cauldron. Gideon held the animal steady as it twitched, and finally went still. He wiped the blade on the hog's flank and stood up, his breathing barely elevated. He handed the knife back to her handle first. "Water's boiling," he said, his voice a low rumble. For the next 5 hours they worked in a grim, silent choreography. The romance of the frontier was a lie sold in dime novels. Survival was grease, blood, and aching joints. They hauled the carcass to the scraping table. Gideon poured the scalding water over the coarse hair, and Abigail used a dull bell scraper to peel the bristles away. The steam rose around them in thick clouds, smelling of wet dog and hot iron. Gideon wielded the cleaver like it was an extension of his arm. He didn't ask how she wanted it broken down. He just knew. He separated the hams, cut the chops, and stripped the fat back for rendering. His hands were slick with grease and blood, the stump of his missing finger making him grip the heavy cleaver with a slight, awkward angle that somehow never slowed him down. Abigail stood beside him at the salting barrel. She rubbed coarse rock salt into the fresh meat, her split knuckles burning furiously as the salt found every open wound on her hands. She winced, sucking in a sharp breath. Gideon paused. He looked down at her hands, submerged in the bloody salt mixture. "Salt heals," he said quietly. He didn't offer to do it for her. He didn't offer pity. "Salt burns," Abigail corrected, her jaw tight. "Same thing," Gideon replied, turning back to the ribs. She looked at him. The buffalo coat was discarded on a fence post. His flannel shirt was rolled up to the elbows, his forearms thick with muscle and corded veins, splattered with gore. He was a terrifying sight, a man built for violence. Yet, as she watched him work, slicing the meat with careful, deliberate precision so nothing was wasted, the deep, paralyzing fear that had gripped her since Caleb's death eased. Just a fraction. Thomas sat on the porch steps, wrapped in his blanket, clutching his wooden horse. He was watching them. He was watching Gideon. "He doesn't talk," Abigail said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Thomas. Not since the winter." Gideon didn't look up from his work. The heavy cleaver chopped through a bone with a sharp thwack. "Silence ain't empty," Gideon said. "Boy's just holding on to things he doesn't know how to carry yet. He'll put 'em down when he's ready." Abigail stared at the side of his weathered face. It was the longest sentence he had spoken since he arrived. There was a raw, unpolished truth in it that struck her chest harder than a blow. She looked down at the meat, rubbing the salt in deeper, letting the burn anchor her to the moment. By dusk, the meat was hung in the cold cellar, the fat was rendered into white lard in heavy jars, and the yard was scrubbed with lye. Abigail's back was a single, screaming wire of pain. Gideon went to the pump, stripped off his ruined shirt despite the freezing wind, and washed the blood from his chest and arms with freezing water. Abigail stood in the doorway of the cabin, holding a clean towel. She watched the water run over his back. It was a road map of violence. Thick, ropey scars crisscrossed his shoulder blades. A puckered, circular burn mark sat just above his left kidney. He had lived a life of brutal collisions, and he wore the receipts on his skin. He walked toward the barn, drying his face with his bare hands, slipping back into his heavy buffalo coat. He didn't look toward the house. He just faded into the shadows of the falling night. It started not with a sound, but with a smell. Abigail woke in the pitch black. The cabin was freezing, the fire in the stove having died down to grey embers hours ago. She lay perfectly still in the narrow bed, her heart kicking into a heavy, irregular rhythm. It was faint, slipping through the drafts in the floorboards, the sharp, chemical bite of kerosene. She threw off the quilts. The sudden cold raised goosebumps on her arms. She didn't bother with her boots, stepping onto the freezing wood floor in her woolen socks. She moved in the dark, her hands finding the familiar shapes of the furniture by memory, until she reached the heavy oak table. Her fingers brushed the cold steel of the Navy Colt. She grabbed it, thumbing the hammer back. The metallic click was terrifyingly loud in the silent room. She moved to the window, keeping to the side, and peered out through the frost-rimed glass. The yard was bathed in pale moonlight. There were no horses, no shouting, but near the north wall of the barn, where the dry winter hay was stacked against the timber, 3 shadows moved. One of them struck a match. The sudden flare of yellow light illuminated a face wrapped in a red bandana. The man touched the match to a rag stuffed into the neck of a glass bottle. Fire. Abigail didn't think. The sheer, overwhelming instinct to protect her son, to protect the last physical piece of her life, overrode her terror. She unlocked the heavy door, threw it open, and stepped onto the porch, the freezing wind cutting right through her thin nightgown. She raised the heavy Colt with both hands, aimed at the shadows and pulled the trigger. The gun went off with a deafening, concussive roar. The heavy recoil violently kicked her wrists upward, nearly tearing the gun from her grip. A massive plume of white smoke blinded her for a second. She missed the men entirely, the heavy .36 caliber ball splintering the wood of the barn roof. But the gunshot shattered the silence of the valley. The man holding the bottle panicked. He dropped it. The glass shattered against the frozen mud, and the kerosene ignited with a soft whoosh, sending a pool of orange flame spreading across the ground, inches from the dry hay. The three men spun toward the porch, drawing their revolvers. Abigail tried to cock the hammer again, her thumbs slipping on the stiff metal, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't get a grip. "I'm going to die right here." The thought flashed through her mind, cold and clear. Before the men could fire, the barn door exploded outward. Gideon didn't just walk out. He erupted from the shadows like something dragged up from hell. He was shirtless, barefoot, wearing only his heavy wool trousers. In his hands was the Sharps buffalo rifle. He didn't yell. He didn't issue a warning. He brought the heavy rifle to his shoulder and fired. The roar of the Sharps was twice as loud as the Colt. A massive tongue of orange flame spat from the barrel. The man nearest the fire was thrown backward, as if kicked by a mule. A hole the size of a fist punched through his shoulder. He hit the mud, screaming in agony. The other two men instantly turned their guns on Gideon, the flashes of their revolvers strobing in the dark. Crack, crack, crack. Gideon dropped the empty Sharps. He didn't dive for cover. He stepped into the gunfire, his face a mask of cold, predatory rage. He reached his right hand down to his hip, pulling a heavy, bone-handled Bowie knife from a sheath. One of the men, terrified by the giant bearing down on him despite the bullets flying, turned and ran toward the tree line. The second man fired his last round. Abigail saw Gideon flinch. His left shoulder jerked violently backward, spraying a fine mist of blood into the firelight. But he didn't fall. He didn't even break his stride. He closed the distance in two massive steps, grabbing the shooter by the throat with his left hand. He drove the man backward into the side of the barn with a sickening crunch of timber and bone. Gideon raised the Bowie knife. The firelight caught the polished steel. "No!" Abigail screamed, her voice tearing her throat. Gideon froze. The knife was inches from the man's chest. He turned his head slowly, looking at Abigail standing on the porch, lowering the Colt. The fire was spreading now, catching the edge of the loose hay. Gideon looked back at the man pinned against the wall. The shooter was sobbing, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror, staring at the missing fingers on Gideon's hand, gripping his throat. Gideon lowered the knife. He didn't stab the man. Instead, he brought the heavy brass pommel of the knife down viciously against the side of the man's head. The man went limp instantly, sliding down the barn wall into the mud. Gideon spun around. The pool of kerosene was licking at the stack of hay. He didn't look for a bucket. He dropped the knife, fell to his knees in the freezing mud, and began violently shoveling dirt and frozen muck over the flames with his bare hands. Abigail dropped the gun on the porch. She ran down the steps, her bare feet hitting the icy mud. She dropped to her knees beside him, ignoring the freezing sludge soaking through her nightgown, and began clawing at the dirt, throwing it onto the fire. The heat blistered her already raw knuckles. The smoke choked her. But they worked furiously, two frantic shadows in the dark, throwing freezing earth onto the flames until the orange glow choked out, leaving only the hissing smell of burnt oil and scorched mud. Abigail sat back on her heels, gasping for air. Her chest heaved. The yard was quiet again, save for the moans of the man with the shattered shoulder in the dirt nearby. She looked at Gideon. He was still on his knees. The adrenaline was fading, and the reality of the violence was settling in. In the pale moonlight, She saw the dark, wet stain spreading rapidly down his left arm and over his chest. He was breathing heavily, his head bowed. He looked at the blood on his arm with a detached, clinical curiosity. "You're shot," Abigail gasped, her voice trembling. Gideon reached up with his right hand, probing the hole in his left shoulder. He winced, a sharp hiss escaping his teeth. "Through and through," he muttered, his voice tight. "Missed the bone." He looked at the two bleeding men in her yard, then up at her. His flat hazel eyes were dark with pain and something else, a heavy, exhausted resignation. "They'll be back," Gideon said softly. "Next time they'll bring the whole crew." Abigail looked at the blood running down his chest, pooling in the mud. She looked at the ruined hay and the heavy colt sitting on the porch. The world was shrinking down to a brutal, violent point. "Get in the house," Abigail said, her voice dropping the tremble, replacing it with a cold, hard edge she didn't know she possessed. "I need to boil water." The kitchen table smelled of raw alcohol and copper. Abigail had dragged the heavy iron kettle back onto the stove, fueling the fire with the kindling Thomas had stacked days ago. The water was boiling fiercely. She tore 3 long strips of white linen from an old, worn bedsheet. One of the few things she had brought with her from Ohio. Gideon sat in the wooden chair, bathed in the yellow light of the oil lamp. He was pale. The massive expanse of his chest and shoulders looked heavier now, weighed down by blood loss and exhaustion. The bullet had entered just below his left collarbone and exited out the back of his shoulder. It was a messy, tearing wound, leaking steadily. He held a bottle of cheap rye whiskey in his right hand. He didn't drink it. He unscrewed the cork with his teeth, spit it onto the floor, and poured the amber liquid directly into the open wound on his chest. His jaw locked, the muscles in his neck corded, standing out like steel cables. He didn't scream, but a low, guttural groan vibrated in his throat. The smell of the alcohol hitting raw flesh and blood filled the small room, sharp and nauseating. Abigail stood beside him. Her hands were shaking violently. She had patched up cuts from axes and barbed wire, but she had never dug around in a bullet hole. She had a heavy sewing needle threaded with black silk thread, sterilized in the boiling water. "It's going to hurt," she said. It was a stupid thing to say, but she needed to fill the silence. "Just so," Gideon rasped, his eyes squeezed shut, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the freezing draft in the cabin. Abigail took a deep breath. She pressed a wad of clean, boiled linen against the exit wound on his back to stem the flow, then brought the needle to the front. She pierced the torn skin. Gideon's entire body tensed, hard as stone. The skin was incredibly tough. She had to push the needle with the side of a brass thimble to get it through the thick hide of his shoulder. She pulled the thread taut, tying it off with clumsy, shaking fingers. She was standing so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. She could smell the smoke in his hair, the raw sweat of survival, and beneath it all, the clean, elemental scent of rain and pine. "You didn't have to step in front of that gun," Abigail whispered, working the needle through for the second stitch. "Didn't plan to," Gideon gritted out. "Calculated wrong. You could have stayed in the barn. They weren't looking for you." Gideon opened his eyes. They were inches from hers. The flat, washed-out hazel was dilated, dark with pain. "They were burning the roof over my head. I take offense to that." Abigail pulled the third stitch tight. She moved behind him to work on the exit wound. It was worse. The flesh was ragged, blown outward. She had to trim the dead edges with a pair of sewing shears before she could close it. She worked in silence, her hands bathed in his blood. "Where are you from, Gideon?" she asked quietly, snipping a thread. The question slipped out, a desperate need to humanize the massive, violent force sitting at her table. Gideon let out a long, ragged exhale, Everywhere. Nowhere. Depends on who's asking. I'm asking. He was quiet for a long time. The only sound in the cabin was the crackle of the stove and the steady, shallow breaths of Thomas sleeping in the cot across the room. Montana Territory mostly, Gideon finally said, his voice softer, stripped of its gravelly edge by the pain. Trapped the high country. Ran supplies for the army. Did some things that don't wash off. Abigail looked at the thick, raised scars on his back, the burns, the knife wounds. The war? She asked. Some of it. Most of it was after. He shifted in the chair, wincing as the skin pulled. Man gets a reputation for being good at breaking things. Pretty soon that's the only job anyone offers him. He turned his head slightly, trying to look back at her over his uninjured shoulder. You're wondering why I stayed? Why I'm chopping wood and fixing fences? Abigail paused, the needle hovering over his skin. Yes, I've spent 20 years tearing things down, Gideon said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked away, staring at the grain of the wooden table. Figured it was time I tried holding something together. Abigail swallowed around a sudden, thick knot in her throat. The deep cynicism that had shielded her heart since Caleb died cracked, just a hairline fracture, but enough to let the air in. She didn't see a monster sitting at her table anymore. She saw a tired, broken man desperately trying to build a dam against a flood he knew was coming. She finished the last stitch, tying it off securely. She wrapped a wide bandage of clean linen over his shoulder and across his chest, tying it tight to keep the pressure on. She stepped back. Her hands were stained deep red, shaking with exhaustion. Gideon slowly stood up. He swayed slightly, gripping the edge of the table with his good hand to steady himself. He looked down at her small, blood-stained hands, then up to her face. He didn't offer a dramatic thank you. He reached out with his right hand and gently wrapped his massive, rough fingers around her trembling wrist. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt straight to her chest. "Get some sleep, Abigail," he murmured, using her name for the first time. He let go, turned and limped heavily toward the door. "Where are you going?" she asked, panic spiking in her chest. "You can't go back to the barn. It's freezing. You'll bleed to death." Gideon paused with his hand on the iron latch. He looked back at her. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his face, the pale scar cutting through his beard. "Barn's got a draft," he agreed quietly. He walked over to the small hearth, grabbed Caleb's old heavy woolen blanket off a chest, and laid it down on the floorboards right in front of the door. He sat down heavily, resting his back against the solid oak wood of the door, blocking it completely with his massive frame. He laid the empty Sharps rifle across his lap and pulled his Bowie knife from his boot, resting it on the floor beside him. He looked up at her from the floor. "I'll sleep right here," he said, and asked nothing else. Abigail stared at him. The man who had just killed to protect her property, who was bleeding on her floor, was sitting against the door like a guard dog, ensuring nothing would cross that threshold without going through him first. She didn't argue. She walked to the pump, washed his blood from her hands in the freezing water, and went to her bed. For the first time in 8 months, despite the blood in the yard and the threat of Josiah Trent hanging over them like a guillotine, Abigail Miller closed her eyes and slept deeply, anchored by the heavy, steady breathing of the mountain man guarding her door. The fever hit Gideon by noon the next day. Abigail had seen men die of blood poison. It started with a hot flush and ended in a raving, sweating delirium before the heart finally gave out. She spent 48 hours forcing willow bark tea down his throat, pressing cold, wet rags to his forehead, and changing the weeping bandages. He didn't complain. He barely spoke. He lay on Caleb's cot, his massive frame making the small bed look like a child's toy, his breathing a shallow, wet rattle in his chest. In his fever dreams, he didn't call out for a mother or a lost love. He spoke in clipped, violent commands. Hold the line, left flank, reload. The ghosts of the war he couldn't wash off were pacing the floorboards of her cabin. By the morning of the third day, the fever broke. The heavy, suffocating heat in the room lifted, replaced by the bitter draught of late November. Abigail was at the stove, stirring a pot of thin cornmeal mush, when she heard the metallic clack-clack of a rifle action. She turned. Gideon was sitting on the edge of the cot. He was the color of old ash, dark circles carving hollows under his eyes, but his hands were steady. The heavy Sharps rifle lay across his lap. He was checking the breech. You shouldn't be sitting up, Abigail said, wiping her hands on her apron. They've had 3 days to bury their pride, Gideon rasped, his voice raw. He didn't look up. He reached into his canvas saddlebag on the floor and pulled out a small iron crucible, a bar of raw lead, and a block of yellowed tallow. Josiah Trent won't wait for the snow to lock him in. He'll come today. He stood, swaying heavily for a second before his good leg caught his weight. He carried the supplies to the kitchen table. Stove hot? Abigail nodded slowly. Yes. Bring the coals forward. We need to cast. For the next 2 hours the cabin smelled of burning grease and the heavy, sweet, toxic scent of molten lead. Gideon worked with a slow, agonizing precision. He couldn't lift his left arm above his ribs, so he used it merely to brace the bullet mold against the table. He melted the lead over the stove, skimming the grey dross off the top with a bent spoon. Abigail watched the silvery liquid pour into the brass mold. It hissed, cooling rapidly. Gideon cracked the mold open, dropping the freshly cast, heavy slugs onto the wood. Trim the sprues, he ordered quietly, sliding a heavy knife across the table to her. Abigail sat across from him. She picked up the knife. Her hands were blistered, wrapped in cotton rags, but she pressed the blade against the excess lead on the bullets, shaving them flat so they would seat properly in the brass casings. They worked in a rhythmic, terrifying domesticity, making the instruments of death at the same table where her family ate. You're a good shot, Gideon said suddenly. He was packing black powder into a brass shell. Abigail didn't look up. I missed completely. You shot a heavy-load Navy Colt with one hand in the freezing cold. You held it level. That takes nerve. The miss was just physics. He pressed a grease-coated lead slug into the casing, seating it with a heavy thumb. When they come, you don't aim for the man. You aim for the belt buckle. The recoil will do the rest. A small sound made them both pause. Thomas stood in the doorway of the bedroom. He was watching the silver bullets pile up on the table. He walked over slowly, his oversized boots shuffling on the boards. He stopped next to Gideon's chair. The giant mountain man didn't patronize the boy. He simply stopped working and waited. Thomas reached into his pocket. He pulled out the small, carved wooden horse, his most prized possession, the last thing Caleb had made him. He held it out in his small, grubby hand, pushing it toward Gideon's bloody, scarred fingers. Gideon looked at the toy, then at the boy. For me, Thomas nodded once. Gideon reached out with his right hand and took the horse. It looked absurdly small in his palm. He didn't smile, but the hard, violent lines around his eyes softened into something intensely vulnerable. Obliged, he said softly. He slipped the wooden horse into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, right over his heart. He turned back to the table, sweeping the finished cartridges into his hand. Bar the door, Abigail. Put the boy in the root cellar. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. Abigail's stomach bottomed out. They're here. I heard the horses 2 minutes ago, Gideon said, sliding a heavy cartridge into the breech of the Sharps. They just crested the ridge. The first snow began to fall just as Josiah Trent rode into the yard. It wasn't a gentle dusting. It was heavy, wet flakes that stuck to the mud and swallowed the sound of the 8 horses trampling the frost. Abigail peered through the narrow crack in the window shutters. Her breath caught in her throat. Trent was a wealthy man who liked to play the frontier baron. He wore a heavy broadcloth coat with a fur collar, sitting atop a massive black thoroughbred. But it was the men behind him that brought the copper taste of fear to Abigail's mouth. 6 hired guns, armed with repeating Winchesters, fanning out in a half-circle around the cabin. Calloway was with them, his left arm in a sling from where Gideon had thrown him against the barn, a shotgun resting across his saddle horn. Gideon stood by the door, completely out of sight from the windows. He had dragged the heavy oak table on its side, wedging it against the front wall to create a barricade. "Mrs. Miller!" Trent's voice boomed across the yard, carrying an arrogant, theatrical edge. "I see your feral dog is still off his leash. It's a tragedy about your barn roof." Abigail looked at Gideon. He gave her a sharp nod. "Get off my land, Josiah," she yelled back through the glass, her voice cracking before finding its strength. "Now, Abigail, we are past the point of negotiations," Trent called out. "Your man nearly killed 2 of my hands. I'm an instrument of the law in this county. I have a writ for his arrest. Send him out, sign the deed, and I'll put you and the boy on a train to St. Louis. Defy me, and I'll burn that cabin to the foundations with you inside." Silence stretched. The snow fell faster, dusting the shoulders of the gunman. Gideon looked at Abigail. He pointed to the trap door in the floorboards that led to the small, dug-out root cellar. Thomas was already down there, clutching a lantern. "Get down," Gideon mouthed. Abigail shook her head. She picked up the heavy Colt from the floor. She thumbed the hammer back, the click deafening in the quiet room. She moved to the window by the kitchen, dropping to one knee beneath the sill. Gideon watched her for a second. The corner of his mouth twitched, a ghost of respect. He took a deep breath, wincing as his stitched chest expanded, and kicked the heavy iron latch of the front door upward. He didn't step out. He simply pushed the door open an inch with his boot. The yard erupted. Crack, 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 boom. Wood splintered instantly. The sound inside the cabin was a physical pressure, blowing dust and dead flies from the rafters. Bullets punched through the thin pine walls like paper, tearing holes in the iron stove, showering the room in soot and flying splinters. Gideon dropped low. He shoved the barrel of the heavy sharps through the crack in the door, aimed blindly at the center mass of the riders, and pulled the trigger. The roar of the big .50 caliber rifle shook the floorboards. Through the smoke, Abigail heard a horse scream, followed by the heavy, chaotic thud of a rider hitting the frozen mud. "Spread out! Light it up!" Calloway screamed from the yard. Gunfire tore through the windows, shattering the glass inward in a shower of deadly shards. Abigail pressed her back against the wall, squeezing her eyes shut, covering her ears as the noise became a continuous, concussive wave. The smell of cordite filled the room, thick as sulfur, burning her throat. Gideon reloaded with terrifying speed. Open breech, insert cartridge, close, cock, fire. The booming rhythm of his rifle anchored the chaos. He was shooting methodically, moving from window to window, never staying in one place long enough for the return fire to find him. Suddenly, a heavy boot kicked the back door in the kitchen. Abigail spun around. The wooden door buckled, but the iron bar held. Another kick, and the top hinge tore free from the rotted wood. Through the gap, she saw a man in a filthy duster, feeding shells into a shotgun. He leveled the double barrels at the gap in the door, pointing straight at her. Abigail didn't think. She remembered Gideon's voice. Aim for the belt buckle. She raised the Colt with both hands, leveled it at the splintered wood, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy gun bucked violently. The man outside shrieked, dropping the shotgun. He stumbled backward, clutching his shattered thigh, rolling into the snow. "They're flanking!" Gideon yelled over the ringing in her ears. His face was smeared with black powder and sweat, a fresh streak of blood running down his cheek from a flying wood splinter. He abandoned the front door, moving to the kitchen. He grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove and hurled it through the remaining glass of the side window. As the men outside ducked the flying iron, Gideon shoved his rifle barrel through the frame and fired again. Another man went down in the yard, screaming in agony. The remaining hired guns were breaking. They were paid to intimidate a widow, not fight a barricaded giant who shot like a demon. 2 of the men turned their horses and bolted toward the timberline. "Hold your ground, you cowards!" Trent screamed, his horse rearing in panic. Calloway, desperate and furious, rushed the front porch, firing his revolver wildly through the open doorway. Gideon dropped his empty rifle. He drew the heavy Bowie knife from his belt and threw himself flat against the floorboards, just as 3 bullets tore through the space where his chest had been. Calloway stepped into the doorway, peering into the smoke-filled cabin, his gun leading. Gideon swept his good leg out, catching Calloway behind the knees. The foreman crashed to the floor with a heavy thud, his gun skittering across the room. Before Calloway could recover, Gideon lunged upward. He pinned the man beneath his knee, bringing the heavy brass pommel of the Bowie knife down on Calloway's jaw with a sickening crunch. Calloway went instantly limp. Silence slammed back into the valley, broken only by the moans of the wounded in the yard and the hiss of the snow falling on the hot tin roof. Gideon stood slowly. He was breathing in heavy, ragged gasps. The bandage on his chest was soaked through with fresh blood, the stitches having torn loose in the fight. He picked up his sharps, reloaded it with a shaking hand, and limped out onto the porch. Abigail followed him, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the Colt. The yard was a slaughterhouse. 3 men lay bleeding in the mud. The others had fled. Josiah Trent was still on his black horse, frozen in place. He looked at the carnage, then up at the giant, blood-soaked man on the porch. The arrogance had completely drained from Trent's face, leaving only a pale, naked terror. Gideon didn't raise the rifle. He just stared at Trent with those dead, washed-out hazel eyes. "The deed!" Gideon rasped, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Trent fumbled in his coat with stiff, panicked fingers. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper. He dropped it into the snow. "You don't come back," Gideon said. "You don't send your men. You look at this valley, you ride the other way. If I see your shadow on this ridge again, I won't shoot your men. I'll ride to your house. I'll burn it down with you inside." Trent didn't say a word. He spurred his horse viciously and galloped back up the lane, fleeing into the driving snow. Gideon watched him go until the whiteout swallowed the rider. Only then did the tension bleed out of him. The sharp slipped from his grip, hitting the porch boards. He swayed, his eyes rolling back in his head, and collapsed onto the snow-covered steps. The winter settled in hard and fast. The snow piled up to the window ledges, locking the world away in a silent, freezing white. Gideon didn't die. Abigail spent the next 3 weeks fighting a war of inches for his life. The torn stitches had caused massive blood loss, and the fever had returned with a vengeance. She barely slept. She boiled snow for water, fed him broth made from the last of the salted pork, and packed his wound with yarrow and clean linen. Through the darkest nights, when the wind battered the cabin and Gideon burned with fever, Thomas would sit by the cot. The mute boy would read aloud from Caleb's old Bible, halting, quiet words, the first he had spoken in almost a year. The sound of the boy's voice seemed to anchor Gideon when the delirium tried to pull him under. By late December, the deep freeze cracked. A false spring brought a temporary thaw, turning the snow to slush and filling the creek with rushing water. Abigail was at the table, mending a torn shirt, when the front door opened. Gideon walked in. He moved slower now, a permanent stiffness in his left shoulder, the heavy limp a little more pronounced. But his color was back, and the hollows in his cheeks had filled out. He was carrying an armful of split oak, which he dumped into the woodbox with a loud clatter. He didn't take his coat off. He stood by the stove, warming his hands. He looked around the cabin, his eyes lingering on the patched bullet holes in the walls, the new glass Abigail had painstakingly set into the window frames. "Woodbox is full," Gideon said, his voice a low rumble. "Pigs are butchered. Fences on the north ridge are mended. The tin on the barn roof is nailed down tight." Abigail's hands froze on her needlework. Her chest tightened, a cold, heavy stone dropping into her stomach. She knew what this was. She had known it was coming since the fever broke. "Trent hasn't been seen in town for a month," Gideon continued, staring at the iron stove. "Word is he's moving his operation to Wyoming. So the job is done," Abigail said. Her voice sounded thin, brittle to her own ears. Gideon finally turned to look at her. "I said I'd ride out when the weather broke. Trail's muddy, but the pass is clear." Abigail put the needle down. She stood up. She didn't want to cry. She was too tired, too cynical, too weathered by this brutal land to weep over a man leaving. But the thought of the cabin returning to its hollow, terrifying silence was physically painful. She walked over to him. She didn't look down. She looked straight into his scarred, weathered face. "You paid for that barn roof in blood," she said, her voice shaking, raw and imperfect. "You paid for those fences. I don't owe you a damn thing, Gideon, and you don't owe me." Gideon's jaw tightened. "I ain't a house pet, Abigail. I carry violence like a shadow. It ain't right for the boy. It ain't right for you." "I pulled a trigger," she fired back, the anger finally breaking through her control. She pointed to the kitchen window. "I shot a man on that porch. Don't you dare talk to me about violence like I'm some fragile porcelain doll. We survived. We survived because you stayed." Gideon stared at her, stunned by the sheer, feral intensity in her eyes. "I don't need a hired hand," Abigail said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. She reached out, her calloused, blistered fingers gently touching the thick canvas of his coat over his chest, right where his heart beat beneath the pocket that held Thomas's wooden horse. "But Thomas spoke yesterday. He asked if you were going to teach him how to whittle." Gideon swallowed hard.